December 12, 1943. The cold wind cut through the cockpit like a razor as Oberleutnant Hans Keller banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109 over the gray expanse of northern Germany. Below, the patchwork of forests and industrial towns stretched into the horizon, calm and unaware. Above, the sky was no longer a sanctuary, it was becoming a battlefield. Keller's squadron scanned the heavens with practiced eyes, spotting specks of silver in the distance. Allied bombers. The familiar silhouettes of B-17 flying fortresses loomed against the clouds, plodding toward targets deep in the Reich. Keller's lips curled into a confident smirk. "Another day, another escort," he muttered, flicking his fingers across the throttle. Around him, his fellow pilots shared the same smug certainty. Then something small, sleek, and fast appeared beside the bombers, a new fighter the Allies had deployed, the P-51 Mustang. Its polished silver frame glinted in the morning sun, and for a brief moment Keller's brow furrowed. "Just another one of their machines," he said dismissively, though a flicker of unease gnawed at the edges of his confidence. His wingman, Friedrich, chuckled. "They all look the same, easy pickings. We've beaten these types before." The Mustang danced with a grace the Messerschmitts weren't built to match. It weaved through the bombers as if it belonged there, a predator, in the heart of Germany's sky. Yet the Luftwaffe pilots, blinded by routine and arrogance, did not recognize the threat. To them, it was just another Allied fighter, another fleeting nuisance to be swept aside before the real work of defending the Reich could begin, but tension crackled in the air. Keller couldn't shake the odd precision in the Mustang's movements, the way it seemed almost to anticipate the Messerschmitt's maneuvers. Each dive and climb was perfectly executed, protecting the lumbering bombers with uncanny skill. Somewhere deep in his gut, a warning sparked a premonition of chaos he was unwilling to admit aloud. The bombs were still far off, and the first skirmish had barely begun, but already the rules were shifting. Germany's long-cherished air superiority was not as unchallenged as they believed. Across the sky, the Mustang carved a new reality into the clouds, rewriting the rules of engagement before the Luftwaffe could even understand them. Keller gritted his teeth, scanning the horizon for a weak point that simply didn't exist. Around him, other pilots shouted over the radio, frustration edging their voices. Something was different this time. Something faster. Something smarter. And it was no longer enough to rely on experience and skill alone. The Mustang had arrived not as a curiosity, not as an ordinary fighter, but as a harbinger. A nightmare in polished aluminum, capable of striking deep into the heart of the Reich. With impunity. The Luftwaffe's confidence wavered, even if they didn't yet know why. Somewhere above the clouds, a silent truth settled over the German pilots. The war in the skies was about to change forever, and none of them were ready for it. The winter of 1943 had settled across Europe like a heavy gray blanket, but high above the snow-dusted forests and industrial towns, the skies were alive with the roar of engines. The Luftwaffe was confident too. Confident. Oberleutnant Keller and his squadron had grown accustomed to dominance in the skies over Germany. Every bomber intercepted, every Allied fighter downed, had reinforced the belief that their reign was unchallenged. But this day, like so many others that would follow, was about to prove them dangerously wrong. The P-51 Mustang had arrived, and it was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had seen before. Pilots whispered about its speed, how it could climb, dive, and turn faster than anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. Its range was even more remarkable. It could escort Allied bombers on missions deep into German territory where no other escort had dared venture before. Keller, watching the horizon, had only a momentary inkling of its capabilities, dismissing it as just another experimental Allied fighter. Across Europe, Allied air bases buzzed with excitement. Captain James Jimmy Thompson adjusted his flight goggles as he climbed into the cockpit of his P-51D. He could feel the raw power of the Merlin engine beneath him, and a grin crept across his face. "Let's see what these guys are made of," he muttered, his voice tight with anticipation. Beside him, Lieutenant Robert "Bob" Sinclair checked his instruments, his jaw set. Both men had flown countless missions in older fighters, but the Mustang offered something different, a sense of invincibility. Their first encounters were deceptively small. Over the outskirts of Frankfurt, a handful of Messerschmitts scrambled to intercept an incoming formation of B-17 bombers. Thompson and Sinclair, leading a small flight of Mustangs, swooped in with precision. The Luftwaffe pilots, expecting an easy skirmish, were met with something they couldn't comprehend. The Mustangs weaved through the sky with fluid grace. Their pilots had the advantage of superior speed and tighter turning radius, and the new aircraft's firepower was precise and devastating. A Messerschmitt attempted a dive on a bomber, only to find a Mustang intercepting it in seconds, guns blazing. Another Luftwaffe pilot tried to flank the formation, only to be cut off mid-maneuver, forced into a retreat. Keller watched, disbelief clouding his mind. They moved too fast, he muttered, almost in shock. Friedrich, normally brimming with arrogance, fell silent beside him. Around them the squadron scrambled, but the Mustangs were everywhere, predicting their moves, cutting off their paths, forcing them into defensive positions they had never practiced. Meanwhile, Thompson and Sinclair felt a growing confidence. Every maneuver, every interception reinforced the Mustang's superiority. "It's like flying a bullet with wings," Sinclair laughed, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Bombers that had once been sitting ducks now flew with an invisible shield, the Mustang's presence alone deterring attacks. News from these early missions spread quickly among Allied forces. Pilots who had flown under constant fear now spoke with a quiet optimism, knowing they had a chance against the Luftwaffe's best. Air bases buzzed with the electricity of this new possibility, and mechanics whispered in awe about the aircraft's performance. The Mustang wasn't just another fighter, it was a revolution in the sky. Back over Germany, the Luftwaffe struggled to process what they had witnessed. Experienced aces who had faced countless Allied fighters found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outclassed. The arrogance that had defined them for years began to crack. "This is impossible," Keller hissed, diving to avoid another precise burst of gunfire. His wingman, pale and shaken, added, It's not. Like anything we've ever seen?" The skirmish ended as abruptly as it began, the remaining Messerschmitts retreating to regroup, but the damage was done. The message was clear: the Mustang was no ordinary aircraft. It had shown, even in these small engagements, that it could escort bombers deep into German territory with a level of safety previously unimaginable. Keller's hands trembled slightly on the controls. Somewhere in the distance, the bombers continued toward their targets, unharmed. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was confronted with a reality they hadn't anticipated. The Allies were not just surviving, they were adapting, advancing, and beginning to dominate the skies. The Mustang had arrived. It was fast, it was lethal, and it was changing the war one mission at a time. And as Keller and his squadron retreated toward the clouds, nursing their wounded pride, the thought echoed. In every German pilot's mind, they had underestimated it. And they would soon pay the price. January 14, 1944. The morning sky above northern Germany was a steely gray, heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the tension gripping both sides of the war. At dawn, a massive formation of B-17 flying fortresses rumbled across the horizon, their engines a steady, intimidating drone. Behind them, the newest addition to the Allied arsenal, the P-51 Mustang, cut through the clouds like a blade. Sleek and purposeful, Captain James Thompson led the escort flight, glancing over his squadron of Mustangs. Each pilot's face was set with determination, the kind that only comes from knowing they held the key to the bomber's survival. "Remember," Thompson's voice crackled over the radio, "they're expecting us to falter. We won't." The formation pressed forward, hundreds of miles into the heart of Germany. For the Luftwaffe, this was an opportunity they had anticipated with glee. Oberleutnant Keller had rallied his fighters, confident that the familiar tactics that had decimated bombers before would suffice. But as the German pilots surged from the clouds, the first Mustang intercepted them mid-ascent, guns blazing with pinpoint accuracy. Keller's heart sank as he tried to adjust his maneuvers. Every angle, every dive seemed anticipated. One by one, his squadron found itself outmatched. A wingman barely escaped with his plane riddled by bullets, forced into a hasty retreat. Keller gritted his teeth, the frustration bubbling over. How are they everywhere at once? He shouted into the radio, his voice tinged with panic. Above them, the bombers pressed on, unscathed. The Mustangs weaved a protective barrier around them, diving and climbing with surgical precision. No Luftwaffe fighter could reach the bombers without risking destruction. Each dogfight was tense and chaotic, with tracers of gunfire slicing through the gray skies. Yet the Mustangs remained unbroken, their pilots coordinated, confident, and unyielding. Back in the lead Mustang, Thompson felt the surge of adrenaline that only a life-or-death aerial ballet could produce. "Hold tight," he muttered. "We're not letting a single bomber fall today." His squadron mirrored his determination. They had trained for months, mastered the Mustang's capabilities, and now, for the first time in combat, were seeing their training pay off. The aircraft was not merely a tool. It was a shield, a weapon, and a promise of survival. Meanwhile, Keller and his men were being forced into unfamiliar territory. Every attack they attempted was met with a counter they could not predict. They had faced skilled pilots before, but none had the combination of speed, maneuverability, and firepower the Mustangs now wielded. Each failed attempt added to a mounting sense of dread. A bomber in the center of the formation was threatened by a Me-109 attempting to slip through the Mustang cordon. Thompson spotted it in an instant, diving sharply, engines screaming, guns roaring. The Messerschmitt spun violently, smoke trailing from its engine, before plummeting toward the forest below. Keller saw the plane vanish and knew he had just witnessed something unprecedented. A fighter that could dictate the outcome of an entire engagement. As the formation pressed on, Allied morale soared. Bombers that had once felt like floating coffins now moved with a sense of security. Radio chatter was filled with gratitude, awe, and, for the first time, hope. "Keep them close," a bomber pilot called. "These Mustangs, they're unbelievable." By the time the bombers reached their target and returned unscathed, the psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was profound. Experienced aces who had survived countless engagements were stunned into silence. Keller's pride and confidence had been shattered, replaced with a gnawing fear. Every successful mission reinforced a harsh truth. The Mustangs had altered the very rules of aerial warfare. Reports from across the front echoed the same realization. The Mustang wasn't just an escort, it was a revolution. Bombers that had once suffered heavy losses were now completing missions without a single casualty. The Luftwaffe's tactics, once feared and respected, were suddenly inadequate against an enemy they could not outmatch in skill or technology. Keller, staring at the retreating Mustangs and the untouched bombers beyond, could only mutter under his breath, "This isn't just another fighter. It's a nightmare." Around him, the other pilots shared the same stunned silence, the air heavy with disbelief and frustration. For the Allies, the success was electrifying. The P-51 Mustang had proven itself, not through theory or testing, but in the harshest classroom of all, battle. The air war over Germany was changing, and with every mission, the Mustang cemented its reputation as the ultimate guardian of the Allied bombers. High above the winter landscape, the Mustangs cut through the clouds like steel arrows, unstoppable, untouchable, rewriting the rules of the skies. And far below, the Luftwaffe was left to reckon with a new reality. The age of air dominance they had taken for granted was over, and the Mustang had arrived to claim its place at the top. February 2nd, 1944, the skies above central Germany were heavy with the quiet tension that comes before a storm. Oberleutnant Hans Keller led his flight once more, this time not with the confident arrogance of a seasoned ace, but with a gnawing unease that had begun to shadow every sortie. The rumor of a new Allied fighter one that could escort bombers deep into German territory and return unscathed had become undeniable. The P-51 Mustang was no longer a curiosity. It was a threat that demanded respect. Keller glanced at his wingman. Lieutenant Friedrich Meyer, whose usually cocky grin had vanished. "I don't like this," Friedrich muttered, his hands tightening on the controls. "They anticipate our every move. It's unnatural." Keller said nothing, his jaw tight. He had tried to dismiss the stories, to convince himself and his men that it was just luck, that the Mustang pilots were inexperienced. But the missions were piling up, and each one confirmed the growing nightmare, the old tactics, the dive, the climb. The flanking maneuver simply didn't work anymore. Their first engagement that day began as routine. A flight of Allied bombers lumbered across the horizon, with Mustangs flanking them like shadows. Keller dove toward the formation, expecting resistance from bombers first, then a scattering of fighters. But the Mustangs met them immediately, their approach precise and coordinated. Keller fired a burst at an approaching Mustang, only to find it swerving effortlessly, gunfire missing by mere inches. "Damn it!" he shouted, frustration echoing over the radio. Around him, other German aces experienced the same disorientation. Major Klaus Reinhardt, a veteran who had survived over 50 missions, found himself pulled into a frantic, evasive spiral after a Mustang appeared seemingly out of nowhere. His plane shuddered under hits that barely scratched the Mustang, and for the first time, he hesitation that could cost a pilot his life. The psychological impact was as lethal as the bullets. Streaking through the sky, Keller's mind raced with disbelief. He had flown for years, studied every Allied tactic, every weakness in their aircraft. Nothing had prepared him for this. No formation, no maneuver, no skill could overcome the Mustang's combination of speed, firepower, and endurance. Each German pilot began to feel the suffocating grip of fear. Fritz Weber, a young ace who had recently been celebrated for his skill in dogfights, watched as his squadron mate plummeted in flames after a brief, precise attack by a Mustang. Weber's hands shook on the controls, and his thoughts were a mix of terror and disbelief. It can't be this effective," he muttered, voice trembling. "We've fought tougher fighters than this." But it was true. Time and again, the Mustangs intercepted every attack, every attempt to flank the bombers. Keller's own Me-109 took rounds that should have shredded it, yet the Mustangs adapted, moved faster than he could predict, and struck with brutal efficiency. One by one, the German aces were forced to retreat. Their pride shattered, their confidence eroded. As the battle raged, Keller caught sight of a familiar bomber formation, its engines churning steadily toward the Ruhr industrial zone. Not a single aircraft had fallen. The Mustangs protected them as if they were invincible, cutting off every possible threat. The sight was maddening. Keller had spent years mastering the skies, honing every skill, and yet here he was, powerless against an enemy that seemed to anticipate every thought, every maneuver. In the silence between dogfights, Keller's mind replayed the earlier missions, the Mustangs darting between bombers and fighters with an almost preternatural grace. He remembered the loss of comrades, the smoke trails disappearing into the horizon, the frustration etched on every ace's face. It was a revolution in combat, and the Luftwaffe was already on the losing side. By the time the engagement ended, the sky bore the scars of battle smoke trails, scattered wreckage, and the echo of engines fading into the clouds. Keller and his remaining pilots regrouped, battered in both body and spirit. For the first time, the realization settled in fully. The Mustang was unstoppable. Not just a machine, but a new force in the air. The turning point had arrived. The once feared Luftwaffe aces were no longer masters of the skies. Each mission confirmed that the Allies had gained a new weapon, one that would alter the trajectory of the air war. Fear, frustration, and disbelief were etched into every pilot's expression, a silent acknowledgement that the game had changed. Keller exhaled, eyes fixed on the retreating silhouettes of the Mustang escorts. They glinted in the waning sunlight, symbols of a power he could not match. Somewhere deep within him, a grim certainty took hold. The skies above Germany would never be the same, and every sortie from this day forward would carry the weight of that knowledge. The P-51 Mustang had proven itself not merely capable but dominant, and the Luftwaffe's greatest aces had been forced to confront a bitter truth. For the first time, They were fighting against an enemy they could not defeat. And the war in the skies had entered a new, terrifying phase. February 20th, 1944, the winter sky above northern Germany was brittle and clear, offering perfect visibility for both sides, but only one truly ruled the air. The P-51 Mustangs had become more than aircraft. They were symbols of a new era in the skies, harbingers of a dominance the Luftwaffe could neither contest nor comprehend. With every bomber mission escorted, the Allies tightened their grip, turning once routine raids into strategic victories that reshaped the war. Captain James Thompson led his flight over the Ruhr Valley, scanning the horizon. Below them, the bombers pressed toward their industrial targets, engines roaring but protected from the lethal interception attempts of the Luftwaffe. The P-51s flanked them, diving and weaving in perfect coordination. Thompson's voice crackled over the radio, steady and confident. Eyes sharp, stay tight. No one touches these birds. For the Luftwaffe, every sortie had become a trial of desperation. Oberleutnant Hans Keller, now seasoned by repeated encounters with the Mustang, convened with his squadron to discuss tactics. They tried new formations, high-speed dives, night intercepts, even altering their approach angles, but every adjustment met with the same result. The Mustangs anticipated their moves, outmaneuvered them, and defended the bombers with ruthless precision. Reports of disastrous encounters filled German command. Experienced pilots who had survived countless missions were being forced to retreat after mere minutes in the air. The morale of the Luftwaffe was crumbling, replaced by fear and frustration. Keller's squadron had lost half its planes in just a single engagement the week prior, and every veteran knew the next encounter could be even more unforgiving. Meanwhile, the Allies began to see tangible results. Factories that had once staggered under sporadic bombing were now suffering sustained, effective attacks. Critical rail lines, weapons depots, and supply centers were disrupted with unprecedented consistency. The Mustangs were the backbone of these operations, ensuring that bombers reached their targets intact. With survival rates far higher than ever before, one particularly famous engagement underscored the Mustang's growing reputation. Over the skies of Leipzig, a formation of 96 B-17s approached a key industrial hub, flanked by a squadron of Mustangs led by Lieutenant Robert Sinclair. A large group of Me-109s dove from the clouds, aiming to pick off stragglers. Sinclair's Mustangs responded with seamless coordination. They cut through the attackers, forcing them into retreat and downing several planes in minutes. The bombers continued unscathed, dropping their payload on the factories below. The mission became emblematic of Mustang dominance: precision, speed, and survival in a single package. Across the front, pilots spoke in hushed tones about the Mustang's capabilities. Allied bomber crews no longer felt like vulnerable prey. Instead, they moved with newfound confidence, knowing that their silver guardians would not falter. Radio chatter between pilots often carried awe and humor, a sign of morale that had not been seen since the war began. For the Luftwaffe, each encounter brought the same bitter realization: adaptation was futile. Even as they devised complex flanking maneuvers, deployed heavier anti-aircraft support, or attempted concentrated fighter groups, the Mustangs simply outran, outgunned, and outsmarted them. Keller found himself repeating a grim mantra before each mission: "It's not just a fighter. It's a machine we cannot beat." Strategically, the shift in air power was profound. Allied bombers could now penetrate deeper into German territory without crippling losses. Industries that had been shielded by fear of interception now faced sustained attacks, undermining Germany's war production and forcing the Luftwaffe into a defensive posture. The Mustang had not just won battles. It had begun to win the war in the air. Every engagement further cemented the Mustang's reputation. Stories of entire squadrons retreating in the face of a single flight of P-51 spread rapidly, both among German pilots and within Allied circles. The aircraft's combination of long-range, maneuverability, and firepower rendered it a force that could not be ignored. To Allied forces, it was a guardian angel. To the Luftwaffe, A relentless predator. As Thompson's squadron escorted their bombers back to base that evening, the sun setting over snow-dusted fields, he glanced at his fellow pilots. "Another clean sweep," he said, exhaustion and triumph mixing in his voice. Around him, smiles and relieved laughter echoed through the formation. The Mustang had proven itself again. Far below, Keller's remaining pilots nursed damaged planes and bruised egos. The air war over Germany had changed, perhaps irreversibly. The Mustangs were not just machines, they were symbols, icons of Allied invincibility. And for every ace that had once ruled the skies, there was now only the bitter taste of frustration and the haunting realization that their supremacy was over. The P-51 Mustang had done more than survive. It had dominated. And as it streaked across the fading light, cutting through clouds with lethal precision, it left behind a simple truth: the skies belonged to those who could fly faster, strike harder, and protect with unwavering skill. And for the Luftwaffe, that truth was a daily, undeniable nightmare. March 3, 1944. The early morning sky over northern Germany was pale, almost serene, a stark contrast to the storm of fear and tension brewing in the cockpits above. For the Luftwaffe, every sortie now carried a weight that had never existed before. Oberleutnant Hans Keller climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf 109, but the familiar thrill of anticipation was gone. In its place was a gnawing anxiety, a quiet dread that seemed to settle over every pilot in his squadron. Each engagement with the P-51 Mustang left invisible scars. The German pilots had been trained to dominate the skies, to strike decisively and retreat unscathed. Now the tables had turned. Keller watched as a younger wingman, barely 20 years old, trembled while strapping into his cockpit. I don't think I can do it," the boy admitted, voice tight with fear. Keller clenched his jaw, wishing he could offer reassurance, but he knew better than to lie. The Mustang had a way of making even the most experienced aces doubt themselves, turning confidence into hesitation and hesitation into disaster across the front lines. Stories of lost comrades, flaming wrecks, and miraculous escapes circulated among the Luftwaffe pilots. Each anecdote carried the same haunting theme: the Mustang could strike anywhere, anticipate every move, and survive in situations that should have been fatal. Veteran pilots, once arrogant and unflinching, now questioned every tactic, every maneuver. The air was thick with doubt, the kind that spreads faster than gunfire. Keller himself had survived multiple encounters, but each one left him more cautious, more hesitant. He replayed the dogfights in his mind, the sharp dives, the sudden attacks, the skillful evasions of the Mustangs, and felt a gnawing frustration. No maneuver, no strategy, no experience could overcome the combination of speed, range, and firepower that the P-51 possessed. Even the aces who had once inspired fear in the Allies now returned to base shaken, their confidence eroded, their morale at an all-time low. In stark contrast, the Allied pilots were soaring on a wave of exhilaration and relief. Captain James Thompson glanced at his bomber charges below, each B-17 intact, their crews alive and smiling. Every mission that returned unscathed reinforced the belief that the Mustang was more than a fighter, it was a protector, a shield in the sky. The psychological boost for the Allies was palpable. Pilots spoke with renewed confidence, mechanics celebrated each successful sortie, and bomber crews moved with a sense of safety they had never known. The human stories emerging from these encounters were just as compelling as the technical feats. Lieutenant Robert Sinclair remembered the panic of a young bombardier whose plane had been critically damaged during a mission. The Mustang squadron swooped in, fending off attackers, and escorted the bomber safely back to base. The relief and gratitude etched on the bombardier's face would never be forgotten. It was a reminder that beyond tactics and machines, lives hung in the balance, and the Mustang had saved them. Back in Germany, Keller reflected on the loss of his comrades. The emotional toll was crushing, not just from the physical losses, but from the creeping realization that no matter how skilled a pilot was, the Mustangs were rewriting the rules. He watched as another young pilot returned from a mission, hands shaking, eyes hollow. The confidence that once drove the Luftwaffe was eroding with every encounter, replaced by fear, frustration, and an awareness that survival was never guaranteed. Even the veterans who had once laughed at the idea of an Allied fighter now found themselves haunted by its presence. The Mustang's ability to appear anywhere, strike precisely, and vanish left the Luftwaffe in a constant state of alert and constant anxiety. The war in the air was no longer just a contest of skill and strategy. It had become a psychological battlefield, where hesitation could be deadly and confidence was a luxury few could afford. As Keller climbed higher into the clouds, he thought of the countless young men under his command, all of them facing an enemy they could not predict or overpower. Each sortie was a test of nerve, and many failed. Meanwhile, across the continent, Allied pilots felt the thrill of invincibility, their morale soaring alongside their aircraft. The contrast could not have been starker, one side trembling under fear, the other thriving in confidence. By the end of the day, the truth was undeniable. The P-51 Mustang had altered not only the physical balance of power in the skies, but the emotional one as well. Fear, despair, and uncertainty now dominated the Luftwaffe, while courage, hope, and determination soared with the Allies. And in every cockpit, in every mission, the human stakes were clear. The Mustang was not just a machine, it was a force that could save lives, break spirits, and turn the tide of war in ways that no pilot had ever imagined. The sky over Germany remained gray, but the battle had moved from engines and bullets to something deeper, the fragile, human heart of every pilot who dared to fly. And in that psychological struggle, the Mustang had already won. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe had been irrevocably changed. The P-51 Mustang had transcended its role as a simple fighter plane. It had become a symbol of technological brilliance, tactical innovation, and the relentless determination of the Allied pilots who flew it. Where once the Luftwaffe had ruled with confidence, now there was caution, hesitation, and fear. The very air that had once been their domain now belonged to the Mustang and the men who mastered it. The consequences of underestimating this aircraft were devastating for Germany. Early dismissals of the Mustang as just another Allied fighter allowed the Allies to test its capabilities in real combat, refine their tactics, and establish long-range escort missions that decimated the Luftwaffe's effectiveness. Experienced German aces found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and forced into retreat. Entire squadrons were shaken and morale plummeted. By the time the Luftwaffe realized the threat, it was too late. The Mustang had already rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. Allied bombers, once vulnerable to relentless attacks, now reached deep into the Reich with a level of protection that had been unimaginable before. Factories, rail lines, and supply depots were struck with precision, crippling Germany's ability to sustain its war effort. The Mustang was not only a guardian of lives in the sky, but a strategic instrument that shifted the momentum of the entire conflict. Its presence allowed the Allies to conduct sustained bombing campaigns with unprecedented efficiency, striking fear into the hearts of German pilots and commanders alike. The pilots who flew the Mustang became legends in their own right. Men like Captain James Thompson and Lieutenant Robert Sinclair embodied courage, skill, and a calm precision under pressure that the Mustang amplified. Each mission told a story of bravery, split-second decisions, and lives saved, proving that technology alone was not enough. Only when combined with human ingenuity and daring could the Mustang achieve its full potential. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang is more than its sleek lines or powerful Merlin engine. It is the story of how a single aircraft transformed the skies, overturned assumptions, and became a turning point in World War II. It is a testament to the pilots who trusted its capabilities, to the engineers who crafted its precision, and to the relentless pursuit of advantage in the air war. As the sun set over the European horizon, the silver Mustangs cut through the clouds one last time, guardians of a new era. For the Luftwaffe, it was a painful reminder of what happens when skill and pride are matched against innovation and adaptability. For the Allies, it was a symbol of hope, mastery, and unstoppable progress. The P-51 Mustang had not only survived, it had dominated, protected, and reshaped history itself. And in the annals of aerial warfare, it would forever be remembered as the fighter that turned the tide, the nightmare that German pilots underestimated, and the unyielding force that defined the skies.